I cut all the tenon material to length and glued it into the various parts. So now I essentially have a bunch of parts that are the same as they'd be if I'd made just regular tenons, not loose tenons. So next up, I'll start putting things together so I can figure out the angles and lengths of the side rails. I've got the front and back assemblies or sub-assemblies together, at least to the point where I can start working on the side rails. So all I need for that in the back is this, and in the front I've got the front legs and the front rails ready to go. So what I need to do next is hold these sub-assemblies in the correct position so I can figure out the side rails. In Jeff Miller's book on making chairs, he describes this jig. And this will be clamped to the front and back rails, and I'll adjust this to the correct distance between the rails. And from there, I can use tape measure and sliding T-belts to figure out the various angles to make those cuts and make those parts. Part of the reason this works is because this rear rail I kept vertical, right? It's not parallel to this surface because this surface is angled forward. I want to make sure that when the chair is complete, this rail is vertical. The front rail was going to be vertical anyway. And that then allows me to use this jig. So I'll put this all together and show you how that looks. I've got the sub-assemblies together now. And, when I made this jig, I made sure that the ends were parallel to each other and everything was square. I also marked center lines on it, so I lined up the center lines on the jig with some center lines I drew on the rails. So everything's good. I made some measurements to make sure that one side is the same as the other. They're within a 32nd, so I'm good to go. So the next thing I'm going to do, I've got just a nice straight piece of material here. I'm going to clamp that in place parallel to where the side rails are going to go, and I will use that to measure the angles that I need for the rails. Because I've got the side rails angled down a little bit and in, and this back leg is angled in and down. The front leg's at least square to the ground, but that really doesn't change anything. All of these angles are going to be compound angles. I've got my reference clamped in place, and there's a little gap here, and when the rail's on here, it's going to be flush with the inside of the leg, the inside of the rail. So because there's a gap here, I made sure there's a gap back here that's the same, which means this is parallel to where the rail's going to go. And then I measured the angle here. Now, when I do this, I want to make sure that I'm holding this. I can't have it angled this way or that way. I want to make sure I'm holding it vertically. And I actually drew a line on here to make sure. So that is the vertical angle. And then if I measure this way, there is the horizontal angle, whatever you want to call it. So I can use these to set up my table saw and miter gauge to make those cuts. Before I head to the table saw, I want to make sure I mark my parts. This rail will go here. And what I want to do is on the end of this, I want to put some exaggerated lines on which way the cuts are going to go. So this is going to go down and in, which means I need to make a cut like that and a cut like that. And that'll help me when I'm at the table saw, make sure I've got this in the right orientation. I've got the saw set up now. So the way I do this, I've got my miter gauge set for the bigger of the two cuts, which is with the part laying flat, and then I've tilted the blade for the other cut. That coupled with, my marks, right? So if I'm making these parts, so these are the right hand parts, that is angled and angled, so I'll make a cut like that. And then for the left hand parts, I'll have to switch to the other side of the blade like that. So it's really important to keep track of what's what, and I've got, of course, got all the parts marked, which goes where. I should be good to go. Now, one thing I did is I've got a piece of scrap here that's just long enough for me to make some cuts and make sure that my angles are correct. So what I did, I made a cut, took it over to the chair and held it flat against the front leg and made sure that the correct surfaces were parallel to my reference, and everything's good. So I can go ahead and make these cuts. It took a little futzing around to finally get all the angles correct and get everything cut to length. One thing I did is I took a 2x4 that I had already squared up, and I made the cuts, the two different cuts on here, so I do have a reference if I need to go back. Because what I found as I was tweaking things, I ended up going back and forth a couple times, and I needed a reference for the previous cut. So everything's all cut, all the same length, the angles look good. Next up, I will do the mortises. So I'm going to, like before, I'll create straight in mortises on the rails and then angled mortises on the legs. I'm about to route the mortises for the side rails, and I want to go over how that's going to happen. So my front rail, everything is square, so that makes it pretty simple. But on the side rails, they're angled, in and down. But my tenons are still going to stick straight out of these rails. So I've laid out on the surface of my parts how these are going to go. So I've got the outline of the part and the outline of the tenon or the mortise. And what I'll do is I will measure the angle off the end of the rail, make a wedge, and then angle this accordingly on my slot mortiser and route in. Now I'm going to route straight in, even though this is going to come in at an angle. So then once I've got my mortise material or my tenon material into the parts, of course this is for this one, I will then, in order to make up for the fact that these are coming into the leg at a slight angle, I will trim the ends of the tenons so that they don't interfere and the parts can come in at an angle. So I hope that makes sense. Once I'm at that point, I'll show you how the ends of these tenons are going to look. All right, I've got the mortises now cut in the legs, and front legs and back legs for the side rails, which there are two of. So they will look like this. Had a couple of challenges. On one of these cuts, I remember I think I said, when I'm making the cuts, say this is the leg, I've got it angled on my slot mortiser. It turns out my wedge, when I cut it on my chop saw, I didn't square up the end first. So my wedge, instead of being angled in one direction, it was angled in two directions. So on that one, I just glued a tenon in some of my tenon material and let it dry and recut it. No big deal, because you're not going to see it. Then on another one, I ended up having the leg on upside down. And so instead of, cutting in at an angle like that, I cut at an angle like that. And that one was going to show. So I'm going to put a picture on the screen so you can see the leg. And because that area is visible, I couldn't just stick my tenon material in, because when I cut it flush, I'd have end grain on face grain. So I needed a plug that was going to be face grain. So when I'm making a project like this, I don't know if you can see it on the screen here, but I've got all the offcuts from everything. I never throw anything away until I'm done. So I was able to find a piece of material from this leg. It's one of this, tapered offcuts. And I made a face grain plug, glued it in. I got lucky because you never quite know where the grain's going to end up. The grain ended up pretty close to the grain on here, and you can barely see it. So I'll show you that now. So next up, I'll put this back together, because the next thing I need to do is create the rear rails for the seat back. I've got the chair all together now, and I've got a reference board here clamped onto the leg so that I can check the angles here for the top and bottom rails on the seat back. So I've adjusted a couple of sliding T-bevels to the big angle, and then another one to this angle here. And I will now go to the table saw and make cuts. Now I've already done the other chair. I just want to make sure I had everything squared away before I videoed all this. So I have cut the joinery here, which I wouldn't typically have done at this point, but I was set up for the other chair, so I did that. So onto the table saw. I've got my miter gauge set up here so that the one angle matches that way, and then the blade is tilted correctly. So I'm ready to do what will be the left side of this top rail. And I have marked on here the angles. I'm going to put some tape on the back side of the cut here just to minimize tear out as I make the cut. And I should be good to go. The first cut's done, and I made the cut twice because typically on the first cut the blade vibrates a little bit because I'm cutting all the way through. So I just make a second cut that's maybe half the thickness of the blade that normally cleans things up and leaves a little better surface. So I held the piece up to the chair. It looks good as best I can tell. And so now I'm going to cut the other side. I rechecked the angles. They're a little bit different. As accurate as I try to be on making all the parts, by the time you get to this point, things are slightly different. So anyway, I've retweaked the angles a bit. So now the miter gauge goes on the other side. I'll flip this around. I do have a mark here that's roughly where I need to be. So I'm going to cut it, of course, a little big to start. And then I will hold it up there and make sure everything's good, do some tweaking as needed, and we should be ready to go. I'm getting close. And as I'm holding it onto the chair, so I'm very carefully holding it there, making sure it's level, making sure it's parallel to the front, because this surface is going to be parallel with the front of the leg. So I'm watching for that and making sure it's level the other direction. And what I find is I need to take a little more off of this surface at the top. So what I like to do, I'm going to hold that up there. I'm watching that gap. That would be exaggerated. So I'm going to move it just a little bit to tweak that angle. I got a tiny gap there, no gap there. And then I'm going to readjust the miter gauge to give me that cut. And I'll make another cut. So I'm going to continue to do that. I'll go back to the first side, probably have to make some minor tweaks there until I've got it dialed in. I've got all the joints cut now. On the top one, I end up cutting it slightly too short. So I just moved the legs in just a teeny bit. Yeah, I've got them clamped here, so that was easy, just a couple hammer taps. And then I started working on the lower one, and it fits nicely now. As before, it took a little bit of tweaking, but once I get that in there, right, I've got lines here, and I wanted it flush with the front. And when I set that in there like that, it looks good. It's the same on both sides. So I've already got my joinery cut here. It's a 1/4 inch back from this front edge. So I will cut similarly mortises here. Of course, once again, I'm going to have loose tenons. So I can put the tenons in there. The tenons are perpendicular to this face, perpendicular to this face, which means they're parallel to this face. In order to cut the tenons on these parts, I will, like as before, I'll make some wedges that hold this and then cut the tenons here. Now, one other thing I should point out, on all the joinery up until now, the tenons have fit tightly in the mortises I cut, so that once I've got, say, one of these parts, this fits tightly. Of course, you always want to fit tightly in the thickness, but it also fits tightly or relatively tightly in the width, so that I know exactly where these go. But in the case of these guys, the upper ones fit fairly tight, but I needed some wiggle rooms on the lower ones because I'm going to have upper and lower, and then I'll have slats in between, and I needed some wiggle room somewhere. So these down here have a little bit of slop in them, so that in case everything's not perfect, these will still fit in. So I'll go ahead and cut these mortises and put the tenons in, and next up I will start cutting these curves.